We are at the moment witnessing a global increase of a democratic peril, a peril that is now being compounded by the pandemic period, during which repressive measures are spreading within our historic democracies. And could you share with us your analysis of the state of freedom and the state of democracy over the world as we're going through this pandemic?
If democracy is very ominous. Let's take the world's two oldest democracies. Britain, 350 years of parliamentary democracy. United States, 250 years of parliamentary democracy. Let's add a third, the largest democracy in the world, India. Let's take a look at the three of them. Britain is facing a very severe crisis. Last year, when Prime Minister Boris Johnson wanted to ram through his personal choice for Brexit, he canceled Parliament. That had never happened. I mean, Parliament gets stopped for technical reasons, but not to ram through a parliamentary, a major decision for the history of the country. This caused a furor in British legal circles. They said the British Constitution is being destroyed. 350 years of democracy, you're destroying it. The Supreme Court did step in and stop him at that point, but it continues. Just last month, he announced that Britain is going to, as he put it in his words, violate international law by refusing to abide by the agreement with the European Union on Brexit. They want to control it themselves, contrary to the proposal that he himself had instituted. Europe is, of course, furious. European Union told Britain in sharp words that they have until the end of this month to come to terms with their obligations in the agreement with Europe and under international law. That's 2 weeks, okay, that's what we're facing. If Johnson doesn't agree, Britain, there will be a sharp break with Europe. The British economy will suffer severely. Britain will it's already having internal turmoil. We don't know where it'll go. That's Britain. Then the United States. It's much worse. You take a look at what's happened in the United States under Trump. The executive branch of the government has been purged. There's not a single independent voice, only sycophants and cowards, like any dictatorship. Now, there are inspectors general imposed by Congress to monitor the behavior of the branches of the executive, to look for inefficiencies, for corruption, other problems. They began to look into the swamp of corruption that Trump has created in Washington. He took care of that very easily. He fired them, all of them. The Republican Senate didn't say a word. Go to the Republican Senate, Trump has a colleague, Mitch McConnell, the majority leader. His goal is to ensure that the Senate doesn't exist. The Senate is supposed to be a deliberative body, receives legislative proposals, discusses them, acts on them, joins with the House of Representatives to produce legislation. Just refuses to look. They won't look at hundreds of legislative proposals. We don't look at them. The most recent one, the most outrageous, was last May. The Democratic House issued a proposal to extend the program, desperately needed program, that's helping people survive the pandemic. McConnell wouldn't look at it. No, I said, the Senate's not going to look at it. They finally did about 3 days before the termination and came out with some ridiculous proposal rammed through. That's the only thing that's done in the Senate, is provide huge funding for the very rich and the corporate sector. So cut back their taxes, give them all kind of gifts and so on. And secondly, stack the entire judiciary, top to bottom, with ultra-right, young, mostly incompetent lawyers who will be able to any mildly progressive legislation for a generation, no matter what the public wants. That's the Senate and the White House, and it's gotten worse. Just the last couple of months, President Trump has amplified and repeated his message that if he doesn't like the outcome of the November election, he won't leave. That's never happened before. And it's taken very seriously. A couple of days ago, two senior military officers, general, lieutenant colonel, highly regarded, retired military officers, wrote a letter to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, an open letter, the chief military officer in the country, instructing him, reviewing for him his responsibilities under the Constitution. If Trump refuses to leave office and surrounds himself with the paramilitaries and armed militias that he's been encouraging all over the country, the duty of the military is to send in military forces. They said the 82nd Airborne Major Military Division, send them in, forcefully remove him. Okay, that's the state of democracy in the United States. There's a high-level commission called the Transition Integrity Project. Leading figures in the Republican and Democratic Party, other political analysts, they've been meeting on the transition. They're actually running what they call war games, the way the military does to imagine a future military conflict. The war games have to do with what happens if Trump refuses to leave office. Every war game they run leads to civil war. That's what we're facing in the most important democracy in the world. Let's go to India, the largest democracy. Prime Minister Modi is systematically destroying every aspect of Indian secular democracy, imposing a right-wing ethnocracy, ultra-nationalist, ultra-religious Hindu state, crushing the Muslim population, hundreds of millions of people, destroying Kashmir, occupied, not a particle of independence. That's what's happening in the largest democracy in the world. There's other things elsewhere. In Europe, throughout Europe, the centrist political parties that have been running the place forever are virtually destroyed. The Social Democratic Party of Germany goes back to mid-19th century. It's gone. Center-left, center-right parties pretty much gone. Anger, fear, resentment against the severely anti-democratic character of the European Union, in which decisions have been moved from national parliaments to an unelected bureaucracy in Brussels. European Commission, unelected, European Central Bank, International Monetary Fund. They make the decisions, others abide by them. What are the decisions? the decisions are those determined by the northern banks, which have their own interests, German banks, French banks. This is a reflection of what's been happening around the world for 40 years. We have been subjected to 40 years of an economic experiment which has been highly beneficial to a tiny percentage of the population, those who implemented it, and disastrous to everyone else, the neoliberal experiment. The ideas, the purposes were expressed very clearly at the opening by the two leading figures, Margaret Thatcher. There's no society, just individuals tossed in the marketplace to survive somehow. No organizations to protect them, destroy the labor unions, separate other people. That's England. United States, the same. Inaugural address by Ronald Reagan, same time. Government is the problem. We have to get rid of government, transfer decisions to totally unaccountable private power. That's where power has to lie. That's where decisions have to be made. And what is their responsibility? We were informed by the economic guru 40 years ago, Milton Friedman. Their sole responsibility is to enrich themselves and their management, period. They have nothing, they can do nothing else, okay? That's 40 years of neoliberalism. We've seen what it leads to. Radical concentration of wealth, kind you have to go back to the medieval period to find anything like it. For much of the population, bare survival, even in a very rich country like the United States with incomparable advantages, and probably 70% of the population gets by from payday to payday with nothing in reserve. Anything goes wrong, too bad. Meanwhile, 0.1% of the population has accumulated 20% of the wealth, twice what they had when Reagan came in. And that's just the bare beginning. When Reagan came in, following the neoliberal principles, what are called libertarians in the West, which is an outlandish term, according to those principles, taxation is robbery. So you shouldn't pay taxes. The government is stealing your hard-earned money. Got to get rid of the government. It's only private power that does things. Private enterprise. Of course, massively subsidized by the government, but they don't say that. Private power has to run everything. So don't pay taxes. Before Reagan, tax havens were illegal. And the law was enforced. Treasury Department blocked people, corporations, who tried to keep from paying taxes by saying they were based abroad. Reagan said, open the doors. We have a libertarian economy. Do whatever you like. And by now, there's tens of trillions of dollars in tax havens. Bermuda, Ireland, Luxembourg. It's ludicrous. That's tens of trillions of dollars stolen from the public. I mean, the government services continue, so somebody pays the taxes, but not the rich. This is the first time in over 100 years that in the United States, billionaires pay lower taxes, less, not just proportion, less absolute taxes than truck drivers, plumbers, so on. And that's libertarianism, okay? There's some aspect of it almost everywhere in the world. And it's led to anger, justifiable anger, the resentment, contempt for institutions, fertile terrain for demagogues of the Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi, Orban type, to come and say, I'm your savior, follow me. I'll stab you in the back quietly, but follow me because I'm going to save you. And the problem is not the corporate sector, not the institutions, not the rich. The problem is the immigrants, the blacks, China, the World Health Organization, somebody. That's the problem that will destroy them, okay? And that's the world we're living in. Fortunately, it's only half the world. The other half of the world is what you see on the streets in the United States, like the Black Lives Matter protest, spread all over the world. Biggest social movement in American history, developed spontaneously, not totally black and white, solidarity, solid, serious programs, enormous public support. Didn't come out of nowhere. That's been developing for years. And the right wing is very worried about it. I don't know if you followed this, but about 2 years ago, the New York Times ran a very important series called 1619. 1619 is when the first slaves were brought. And the series discussed very effectively the hideous history of repression of Black Americans for 400 years, with a very bitter legacy today. They wouldn't have done that a couple of years ago. That's a reflection of changing consciousness and awareness in the population, which just exploded after the Floyd massacre, murder. The right wing is so upset that President Trump has ordered the Department of Education to cut federal funding from any schools, any states where schools use the 1619 program. Okay? Try to tell the truth about American history, we're going to cut federal funding. It's a real battle. It's not just that. Extinction Rebellion, climate strike, sunrise movement have had a very powerful effect. So much so that the major fossil fuel corporations are now deeply concerned. They're under pressure from investors who have tens of trillions of dollars of investment, who are under pressure from popular constituencies, mostly young, to stop funding fossil fuel industries. And the pressures are reaching all the way to the top. Fortune magazine, the main business magazine in the United States. So far to the right, you need a telescope to find it. Take a look at their current issue. It's about how we have to change. We can't follow the Friedman rules of working just for shareholders and management. That was wrong. We've made a mistake for 40 years. We apologize to you. From now on, we're going to work for the stakeholders, for the workers who we love, for the community who we love. We're going to work for you, for them, and not for ourselves. We're going to be what were called soulful corporations. That was the term that was used in the 1950s when the corporations were trying to sell themselves as just benevolent institutions working for the population. We're going to be soulful corporations. We've seen how soulful they were for 60 years, but now they're going to change. Not because they decided to, because they're being pressured, forcefully pressured to. That's having a big effect on fossil fuel industries, on the banks that fund them. Sometimes their internal memos leak and they say, we're in trouble, we're facing reputational risks. That's their way of saying people are going to pull out of us if we keep destroying the world. We've got to change. That's having an effect. So you have two forces. You have those who've created the crisis, are benefiting from it, want to maintain the same the same structures, institutions, even in harsher form, more surveillance and control. Their leader is in the White House saying he's not going to leave if he's voted out. That's one force. Another force is the popular forces all over the world. What's more, they're getting organized. Tomorrow is the opening meeting of what's called the Progressive International. Grew out of the Sanders movement in the United States, out of Diem 25, Varoufakis's movement in Europe, transnational movement seeking to maintain what's of value in the European Union and to overcome its severe problems, like the anti-democratic element that I described. They have voices from the global south. They're meeting in Iceland, where the prime minister is a member of the directing committee. That's tomorrow. That's the Progressive International. There's another international, which doesn't have a name, but it's forming, a reactionary international. It's being led by the White House. It's a concerted effort to bring together the world's most reactionary, harsh states to try to force through a continuation of the systems, of the institutional structures that have led to the circumstances in a harsher form. And it's very clear who's a member. They don't hide it. In the Western Hemisphere, the leading member is the next largest country after the United States, Brazil, under the rule of a brutal, cruel autocrat, Bolsonaro. Another member is India. Already talked about them, a very natural member. These, incidentally, are also the three countries that have by far the worst record on the pandemic. Look at cases and deaths. Highest is the United States. Second is India. Third is Brazil. Then a huge gap way down below is the rest of the world. Some of them handling it very well. So these are the centerpiece of the reactionary international. Actually, their main centerpieces in the Middle East. The family dictatorships in the Gulf, most reactionary states in the world. Al-Sisi's Egypt, the worst dictatorship in Egypt's history. Israel, which has moved very far to the right. Its tacit relationships with the Gulf dictatorships are now being brought to the surface. That's considered a wonderful achievement in the Western image to bring together extreme right-wing repressive Israel with the worst reactionary states in the world. That's being hailed as, even by liberals, as a terrific achievement. We have to praise President Trump for creating this reactionary international based on the most vicious states in the world. Wonderful achievement. That's one. The other is the Progressive International. It's kind of a class war on international scale. If you look at the forces, they look unequal. On one side, powerful, rich states. On the other side, young kids in the climate strike. Okay, who's going to win? It's in the hands of people like you.
I would like to ask you, what are hopes and what are prospects, according to you, facing all these intertwined crises, and among them, and maybe above them, the climate crisis? What are hopes and prospects, according to you, regarding the climate crisis?
The climate crisis is literally an existential crisis. If we don't deal with it, we're finished. Not tomorrow, might be 100 years, maybe 200 years. Civilization's not going to survive with sea levels 10 meters higher than they are today. with heat so extraordinary that much of the inhabited part of the world, people will have to leave, with billions of people fleeing from their homes. We're not going to survive that. And it doesn't come in an instant. It's not going to just happen suddenly 100 years from now. It's happening. It's actually happening right outside my window, literally. I happen to live in Arizona, Southwest. California is on fire. Oregon's on fire. The smoke is extending all over the United States, as far as New York, 3,000 miles away, maybe 1,000 miles away. Pretty heavy smoke outside all the time. Okay, it's a rich, powerful country. We can survive smoke outside. Lots of people can't. The poor, the vulnerable can't. Even in the United States, I can, right? I live in a house with solar panels, so I have air conditioning. Not poor people, and not the people who live near the polluting plants. When Trump eliminates the regulations that limit pollution, allow mercury, methane, CO2 emissions, who suffers? The people who are forced to live nearby, not the people who can move to the suburbs. They may get some of it, but the people who live nearby, they're the ones who suffer. Who are they? Poor, Black, Hispanic. That's why if you look at the statistics on deaths and cases, overwhelmingly poor, colored, people of color, can't do anything else, suffering from the tremendous inequality and repression that's the result. Goes way back, but was greatly intensified by the neoliberal assault. That's happening internal to countries. It's happening across the world. The worst victims are the people with the least responsibilities. It's the rich countries that are responsible, not the poor countries. And within the rich countries, it's the rich who are responsible, not the poor. So if you look internationally, tiny segment of very rich people who've created a horrendous crisis. They will suffer too, but not the way others will. The others are the vulnerable, the weak, the ones who barely didn't contribute to this, but they're the victims. And it's the same with the pandemic. It's quite dramatic. There is, sooner or later, there'll probably be a vaccine, maybe many vaccines, we don't know. But it's possible that there'll be a vaccine. Who's going to get it? There's a struggle over that right now. There's an international organization, COVAX, meeting right away to try to cooperate on producing vaccines. Of course, cooperation facilitates the operation. Groups that are working on it can share results and so on. And they're also working on the distributional problems. How can we ensure that the people who really need it, the poor, the vulnerable, Africans, how can we ensure that they'll get it, that it won't be monopolized by the rich? Well, President Trump just announced his decision. We're pulling out. We're going to destroy the organization. We're pulling out of it because we want to monopolize it, even harming the American population. So it turns out to be pretty likely that the first vaccines will be elsewhere, very likely in China, which happens to be way ahead in the world in testing their own vaccine. They're much far ahead of the world, so maybe they'll be the first. Or maybe they'll be someplace in Europe, maybe they'll be in Brazil, but we won't get it because we have to pull out of international organizations so that we can show how tough and brutal we are. And if Americans die, too bad, improve my electoral prospects. Now, that's what we call democracy in the 20th century. 21st century, okay? And that's what we're seeing. This is a moment where what we need desperately is internationalism, international cooperation. It's being torn to shreds. What I mentioned about England under Boris Johnson is an illustration from the country that's now falling apart and used to be the world dominant power not long ago. Second, now the world dominant power is the same or worse. We pull out of everything. Pull out of the COVAX vaccine meetings, pull out of the World Health Organization. Why? Because then there's somebody to blame for Trump's having killed a couple 100,000 Americans. Can't face that. It's got to be somebody else's fault. It's the World Health Organization. Let's destroy that. What happens when you destroy the World Health Organization? There are uncountable people in Africa, in Yemen, who depend on the World Health Organization services for survival. Okay, let's kill all of them. Who cares? It'll improve my electoral prospects. I can stand up as a super nationalist who's fighting the world. It's surreal. You can't find words for it. But these are the things that are happening. Tomorrow is the first meeting of the Progressive International. This morning, half an hour ago, just before our conversation, I was taking part in a meeting at the Vatican. The Vatican is leading an international effort to try to deal with these crises. Pope Francis has taken a very forthright and progressive position on the need to work internationally to try to deal with these crises. So we have the young people in the climate strike, we have the Progressive International, you have the Vatican, and then you have the rulers of the world, the ones who own the world. They want something very different. And the question is, what's going to come out of this?
So can you explain us how, and maybe above all, what kind of resistance could be, or maybe even should be, the source of this lasting change facing environmental threats for the destiny of humanity? What kind of resistance should be done at the moment?
The basic answer is all kinds. It's a desperate situation. Everything has to be done, from the climate strike, Extinction Rebellion, occupying congressional offices to compel them to put the Green New Deal on the legislative agenda, keep the pressures on so they have to do it, same in every other country, force the banks to move away from funding fossil fuels, put pressure on your, whatever you can, your pension fund, anything there is to make them divest from fossil fuel industries and the banks and financial industries that support them. Reverse the destruction of democracy by any means possible, whether it's third parties or working within existing ones to force them to pay attention to someone other than the rich and powerful to pay for, to deal with the needs of the population. Anything from the legislative arena to work in the streets, organizing people, revitalizing the labor movement, which Reagan and Thatcher moved very quickly to try to destroy, and their successors have continued, Clinton and others, very anti-labor, revive that. All of these things can be done. And we have to bear in mind that we know the answers to every one of these crises. Now, there's very careful, detailed studies by highly competent economists. My colleague, Robert Pollin, Jeffrey Sachs, using a different model to come out with the same results, with a small percentage of gross domestic product, much less than was used to pay off the the institutions that are responsible for the pandemic, the huge CARES program. Much less than that, you can meet the UN goals on emissions. Cut emissions by half within a decade, get to net zero emissions by mid-century. That gives us a chance for a decent survival. How much does it cost? Small fraction of what the Treasury Department just poured in to deal with the first couple months' problem of the pandemic. Tiny fraction of what was spent in the Second World War. All possible. That's not just dealing with emissions. It's creating a much better world. Lots of jobs. There's plenty of work to be done. Construction, decent infrastructure, weatherizing houses, putting up solar and wind panels and wind farms. Ton of work to be done. Way more jobs than in the fossil fuel industries. Blue-collar jobs, scientific work. There's a desperate need of teachers, the hospitals have been run for 40 years on a business model. Business model means no spare capacity, meaning nowhere near enough nurses, not enough diagnostic facilities, rural hospitals collapsing, the main hospitals, the few big ones enriching themselves while the others disappear. All of that can be overcome. It's very good for the population, very good for the job market, good jobs out there, lots of good work, much better life. It's all within reach. Of course, there's an impediment. The rulers of the world, they don't want that. They want to keep enriching themselves and maintaining control. They got a powerful voice for them in the White House, which may refuse to leave. Okay, within a couple of months, we'll see that. This is a real struggle. And it's not that a lot is at stake. Everything's at stake. If this problem isn't solved, we're toast. It's finished. And I should say that this is only one of the problems. It's very striking that there's almost no discussion of another equally or even greater severe problem. We're racing towards terminal nuclear war. The threat is greater than it was during the Cold War. It's getting much worse. Not my opinion. It's the opinion of just about every leading specialist on the topic, including very sober voices, not alarmist, enormous experience. People like William Perry spent his whole life at the top level in the nuclear war management, former Secretary of Defense. He now says he's doubly terrified by the growing threat of nuclear war, doubly terrified because nobody's paying attention. Of course, they're paying attention in arms control circles, almost nowhere else. It's not mentioned in the conventions, nothing said about it in the press, even the left isn't talking about it. That's two huge crises. We're in a confluence of major crises. The environmental crisis, nuclear war, deterioration of democracy, pandemic, all hitting us at once. Each of them is very severe. Together, it's as if some evil demon is performing some mad experiment. But we're in the middle of this confluence of terrible crises, and we know how to deal with each one of them, but it's not going to happen by itself. It's going to take engaged commitment, mainly from people like you, younger people. It's in your hands. This generation has responsibilities that have never existed in human history. Have to decide whether civilization, organized human life is going to persist. Nothing less. The responsibility, it's also an exciting challenge. Do something that no one's ever done before. Create a better world, much better world.
We are very glad to back your thought, your thought and your strength in France.
And remember what your responsibility and what your challenge is. Can never forget that.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Great to be with you.
Thanks.
Thank you very
so
much,
much.
Noam.